that Guy Burgess really didn't believe that Maclean would be able to make the journey on his own.
Philby's career as a spy was over. His friendship with Burgess instantly made him a suspect. Acting quickly, he took measures to ensure that there was no proof against him.
When Philby came under suspicion in Washington and he thought that the FBI might descend on him at any time to search his house, he didn't want to be caught with his Minox camera and the other apparatus that he was using for communication and for photographing documents. And he had to bundle them in a bag and go out into the woods somewhere near Washington or over the border in Virginia somewhere and bury them.
The British Secret Service had let Maclean slip through their fingers, but they intended to follow every lead. In another ironic twist of fate, investigators turned to one of his best friends, Anthony Blunt, to gain entry to Burgess's home.
Almost fortuitously, he accompanied the two officers who went into Guy Burgess's flat and searched it, and he was able to go through Guy Burgess's desk and retrieve some incriminating material, while two officers were in the bedroom examining documents inside a trunk that Guy Burgess had left under his bed.
But Blunt missed one very important clue. Notes not in Burgess's handwriting that documented a lunch conversation with a British civil servant.
The British security authorities went to that civil servant and said, "Did you by any chance keep a diary for 1939? He did keep a diary. They said, "Would you look up on such and such a date and tell us who you had lunch with?" He looked it up and he said, "Oh, John Cairncross." They went and checked Cairncross's handwriting and it fitted. So from that moment, Cairncross's career as a Soviet spy was ended.
By 1952, the spying activities of Burgess, Maclean, and Cairncross had been revealed to the authorities. John Cairncross was safe from prosecution because British law demanded high standards of proof for treason. Kim Philby was living under a heavy cloud of suspicion, but his remarkable luck was about to save him yet again. By the mid-1950s, the Soviet Union's most successful spies had been compromised, their undercover careers terminated. Philby was still in London, highly suspected by British intelligence. Blunt and Cairncross's involvement was still hidden from the public. The press had learned of Burgess and Maclean's departure for Moscow, but few in the West knew how they'd been received by the country they'd served so tirelessly as spies.
From the moment they began to turn up in Moscow, certain elements in the KGB said, wait a minute, why suddenly have we got all these agents coming over here, defecting, when in some cases, like Burgess in particular, it wasn't necessary? Could it just be that this is one of those devilish long-term plots by British intelligence, who they attributed much greater skill and ingenuity and double dealing than actually it ever had?
After a brief stay in Moscow, Burgess was transferred to a small town on the Volga River, a place where the KGB could keep a close eye on him. His chronic alcoholism began to take a toll on his health. Throughout the 1950s, Philby lived in limbo, carefully watched by the British Secret Service. He was out of work and drinking heavily. Officially, Philby was persona non grata at MI6. Unofficially, there were those who remained loyal to him, unconvinced that he was in fact a Soviet spy.
There were two interrogators who confronted Kim Philby. One was a former MI5, wartime MI5 officer, Helenus Milmo. He adopted a rather bullying and blustering approach to Philby, which Philby, in his memoirs, says that he resented. The other approach was Jim Scarden, MI5's resident interrogator, who adopted the more fatherly approach, arm over the shoulder. Now, come on, my boy, let's talk through what must have happened.
Then, as had happened so often in his career, luck intervened. Marcus Lipton was a member of Parliament. Acting on a tip from a secret source, he accused Philby of being a spy.
That caused a statement to be made by the government in the Commons, which was extremely unfortunate, but it was in effect exonerating Philby because at that time there was absolutely no evidence against him, and the government was obliged to clear him publicly.
Philby took advantage of Britain's libel laws, demanding either proof of the charges or an apology. Since proving the case was nearly impossible, the government was forced to exonerate him publicly. Once again, the master spy had gotten himself out of trouble.
Philby held a press conference, and he used that occasion to, in effect, start again, to ingratiate himself in the newspaper community, and he was subsequently assigned to Beirut as a journalist, as a newspaper correspondent for The Economist and for The Observer.
In Beirut, Philby spent time with his ailing father, and he began to write articles for the New Republic. Remarkably, he was again approached by the ghosts of his secret past, both British and Soviet.
Kim Philby's role as a foreign correspondent was to report as a stringer. He wrote plenty of articles. We also know, in fact, that he was in touch with the Secret Intelligence Service fairly continuously and may have supplied that organization with some information. He was also, of course, in direct and constant contact with the Soviets.
But Philby's luck was about to run out. In December of 1962, MI5 discovered evidence that implicated Philby as a key member of the Cambridge spy ring. Working together, MI5 and MI6 sent a representative to Beirut to confront Philby. This time he finally broke, admitting that he had spied for the Soviets. Philby was interrogated on a Friday. By Saturday, he had disappeared.
There is some mystery about precisely how Kim Philby was exfiltrated. The most likely scenario is that he had a meeting with a Soviet handler, that he was taken down to the docks, that he was put on a Soviet ship that then sailed that night to Odessa.
Philby believed himself to be a great hero in the eyes of the Soviets. When he arrived in Moscow, the reception was much cooler than he'd expected.
When he goes to Moscow in 1963, he finally defects. He expects a hero's welcome. Well, he receives a welcome, but he then discovers for the first time that he doesn't have officer rank. He'd fantasized about being a KGB officer. Actually, he never had more than agent status. But it matters so much to him to be important that he spreads amongst British journalists the idea that he's really Colonel Philby of the KGB.
The communism he had fought for and the nation he had worked with to betray his mother country viewed him with suspicion and distrust. He took a Russian wife, Rufina, and struggled to cope with the fact that the KGB wanted little to do with him.
He was disappointed the most about his work, but he was, that's high professional, and he was working so hard, especially for this country, that. And when he came here, he suddenly felt useless.
His KGB handlers made sure that Philby had a nice apartment and plenty of food and drink. But creature comforts mattered little to Philby. For 10 years he'd been consumed with his secret work, and work was the one thing which the mistrustful KGB refused to give him.
They didn't know what to do with him. They isolated him completely, so he was in a golden cage. Philby was not a man who needed money. He didn't. That was nothing for him. He needed some ideology.
The Cambridge Five had begun spying, at least in part, from a desire to improve life and perpetuate freedom. In the Soviet Union, Burgess, McLean, and Philby found an environment of repression, mistrust, and fear.
Donald Maclean, of all of them, right to the end of his life, was the most highly ideologically motivated and kept on writing pressing letters to the Soviet leaders saying, why are we behaving in this manner? What's happened to the revolution and the ideals of Marxist-Leninism?
It is now undeniable that much of Kim Philby's work was ignored or misinterpreted when he first provided it to the Soviets. Philby was one of the great spies of the Cold War, but often his secrets were dismissed or overlooked.
The final tragedy of the Magnificent Five was that the KGB was never really able to use their talents to the full. The Soviet Union actually learnt very little from them. Why? Because the system simply could not absorb what they were saying. Even during the Cold War, the KGB was tremendously politically correct.
While Philby, Burgess, and Maclean were in the Soviet Union, Anthony Blunt had become a respected art critic back in London. In the 1960s, Blunt struck a secret deal with MI5. They were certain Blunt was part of the Cambridge ring, but they couldn't prove it. So MI5 offered him immunity if he would divulge the secrets of the Cambridge spies. It was a decision that would prove controversial once the public discovered Blunt's true identity.
There is a myth that the British intelligence community sought to cover up what Anthony Blunt and others had done because, it'd be just too embarrassing if it was discovered that the keeper of the Queen's pictures, Sir Anthony Blunt, before he was stripped of his knighthood, had actually been working with KGB. No, that's not the case. It is simply tremendously difficult to secure a conviction for espionage unless you actually catch somebody doing it.
In 1979, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher discovered Blunt's deal with MI5. She exposed him in the House of Commons and the Queen stripped him of his knighthood. John Cairncross lived out his life in Italy and France. He was the last to be revealed, the fifth man. When he returned to England, time had healed many of the wounds that his treachery had inflicted. But his old habit of covering up and avoiding the truth remained intact.
Can you say whether you ever passed any secrets?
That is a matter on which I could only reply no comment. There were certain accusations against me, certain evidence. That was examined, and no action was taken. I am entirely unable to add to these because certain rather delicate issues are involved.
But the truth was soon revealed. John Cairncross had indeed been one of the first atomic spies. Harold Kim Philby died in Moscow in 1988. The times had changed, and along with them, the Soviet perception about Philby's service and contribution. He was given full military honors and buried in Kuntsevo Cemetery, the resting place of many distinguished war heroes and honored citizens. In the end, the Cambridge Five risked it all for a system that today lies in ruins. And there are still many unanswered questions about their activities. Pertinent MI5 files remain secret, and many of the MI6 and KGB files are still under lock and key. The full story of the Cambridge Five may never be known. What is known is that the Cambridge Five will go down in history as one of the greatest spy rings of the 20th century.